electric chair.
What about those who say that first, before we reinstitute the death penalty, we should first run such a survey here in the Philippines and see how the statistics develop? Because the criticism is that, all right, there are no statistics based on the Philippine experience. Let's try it. Let's see whether there will be some kind of an opinion survey or some kind of hard data which shows one or the other conclusion. Should we first have that kind of a survey?
This is the empirical approach. Lawyers call this the approach of the Brandeis brief, because Justice Brandeis of the U.S. Supreme Court never argued a case unless he could cite data and figures and statistics. But I doubt very much if we can quantify the problem. This is not just a mere sociological problem that statistics will effectively dispose of. This is a political phenomenon at the same time. And I don't believe you can calibrate the problem by using a statistical approach.
What about the argument that in any kind of system like that, it is always the poor, the disadvantaged, those that cannot have access to smart lawyers and do not have contacts with the judicial system that get punished, that bear the brunt of this kind of penalty?
That may be true, but in my experience in the regional trial court, much will depend on the competence of the judge. If the judge is intent on discharging his proper functions, which is to administer justice with an even hand, and we know that the scales are not balanced because the one litigant on the one hand belongs to a rich family and can therefore afford all the amenities of the judicial system that money can buy, and on the other hand, the opponent or the adversary, the other litigant, is a poor man who will have to depend on public charity in order to defend himself. If the judge were fully conscious of his judicial functions, which is to balance the scales of justice, nonetheless, that effect that some Cassandras of doom predict will not take place.
When you were a judge, did you have an occasion to impose a death penalty on any of the
No, although I was willing to, for the simple reason that no case before me for 5 years ever presented the full configuration of qualifying or aggravating circumstances that would have justified the imposition of the death penalty. I remember that I imposed life sentences several times. On several accused, I may have imposed the death penalty 2 or 3 times as mandated by law, but I wasn't able to impose the death penalty, not because of any unwillingness, but simply because the legal qualifications had not been met.
Okay, now, another controversial subject, the Welgang Bayan, which is due to start this Thursday, and if it escalates, then it begins to be a much bigger problem than had been initially anticipated. Let's talk about the central issues first behind the Welgang Bayan, the rollback in oil prices and the question of the import levy reduction. Number one, do you think that the oil, that fuel prices should be reduced or even rolled back to December 1990 levels?
I advocate and I support the proposition that they should be at least reduced. Today's newspapers carried the headline that the administration, the president, might consent to a 3 peso per liter reduction, whereas the rallyists proposed that it should not be less than 5. So apparently the gap is closing. At first, the government took the hard line that it would not grant any reduction whatsoever. So apparently, both the demonstrators and the administration are now in the process of finding a confluence of thought. So apparently, even society in general no longer opposes a proposed reduction, and I am one of those who are in favor of the reduction.
The theory, of course, in opposing a reduction is that we don't have the resources. No? Number one, we have the OPSF fund. Aside from the fact that it has to be the deficit that the OPSF has to be completely erased. There was a point of view at one time that it also had to work up a surplus so that we could use that for other purposes, of course, with proper legislative authorization. But in doing that, a lot of people said that we were prolonging the suffering of a lot of our people. Now, where would you come down in that kind of an argument? Some people say, and this is probably a matter of policy which you as president would have to face, it's a classic confrontation between populist ideas, no? and hard economic facts, which your economic advisors might tell you is the right thing to do. Your political advisors would tell you, well, that's not the popular thing to do. Where would you come down if that kind of a conflict ever hit you as president?
The OPSF deficit would have been wiped out in any event in the very near future. Some say it would have been wiped out by July 22. The administration says between August 10 and August 15. So we don't have the deficit to contend with anymore. The government by that time would have gotten back on its feet. The question now is, do we want to continue with the OPSF? In effect, this fund is a subsidy, and in the long run, a subsidy is always expensive to the ultimate end user or the consumer. And my position in general is that I am opposed to any subsidy, just as I am opposed to monopolies in general. I am therefore in favor of scrapping the oil price stabilization fund because it is a subsidy. Now, if the argument is that the OPSF should be used to fund other activities instead of simply acting as a buffer against escalating or de-escalating oil prices, my answer is this. During the Marcos administration, we harshly criticized that gentleman because he used the term to save the republic and reform society as a catch-all phrase for instituting all manner of activities. Some people say outside the perimeters of the Constitution at that time. Now, in effect, this is what some economists want to do with the term oil price stabilization fund. They want to use it as a catch-all economic panacea for everything, for raising funds for purposes that have no connection, direct or indirect, with oil products. So I say, if you want to raise funds for certain purposes, call it by its proper name. Don't do it to an oil price stabilization fund.
What would you substitute the OPSF fund for if you were to completely remove it? The purpose of that was precisely to try to cushion the effects of variations in the encyclical movements, for example, in oil prices all over the world due to several factors. But what would you do, if anything, to substitute it so that we would get insulated from that kind of up and down, or would you be in favor of a total deregulation of oil prices?
The latter. In the ultimate future, we still have to bite the bullet. With the OPSF, we're simply postponing and sometimes aggravating a problem. So I say, since we have a free enterprise economy, let the free market dictate the price of oil. It is not the function of government to manipulate free market forces.
Then you would really hit that question I asked earlier, populism versus hard economic data, because some people are asked whether we have the political will to allow that sort of thing to happen, because the oil companies, depending on situations happening outside of their control, essentially, might be adjusting prices up and down. So, I mean, would we be prepared for that kind of...
We would if we had a leader who is strong, decisive, and visionary. If he can explain why a sacrifice is necessary, and even more importantly, if that leader has credibility, he will not have difficulty leading the Filipino people, because we are not a nation of imbeciles. We are now one of Asia's most literate countries. But the problem is that today there is almost total lack of credibility in government.
What about the argument that kind of policy would just again put all of the hardship on those that can least afford it? Because if the oil companies were able to make a case for a very high oil price, depending on developments abroad, then the immediate effects on that, for example, the whole thing about diesel prices, no? If it turns out that had to be jacked up very high, then all the jeepney drivers and all of the public utility operators would scream. What would you say in the kind of a situation like that?
Now, that kind of question would be puissant. It would be a valid question if we were treating this economic matter in a vacuum, all by itself. But the economy is never a simple matter to unravel. It always has a